Hi guys! Tonight we're walking slowly into a world that vanished more than 3,000 years ago, where cold winds move over dark Anatolian hills and distant fires burn behind stone walls beneath a sky without electric light, without engines, without the constant pulse of modern noise. A world carried instead by hoofbeats, bronze tools, cedar smoke, wet wool, and the uneasy sunuts between neighbouring kingdoms. You can almost feel the air changing already. Outside, the night keeps moving at its own patient pace. Somewhere a floorboard settles, somewhere distant traffic fades into a softer hum. Your attention settles naturally on quieter things now. The sound of breathing, the shape of candlelight against old stone, the slow rhythm of footsteps crossing packed earth after sunset. The Hittites lived in a landscape that could feel enormous and lonely. Central Anatolia was not gentle country. Winters bit hard into exposed hillsides. Summer dust drifted into mouths and eyes. Roads dissolved into mud after heavy rain. Villages clung to valleys where grain might survive another season. Nothing came easily there. And perhaps that is part of why these people became so formidable. So before your attention drifts fully into another century, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if you genuinely enjoy these quiet nights of history with me, and if you feel like it, share your location, your local time, and the part of history you always return to when the world grows too loud. It is strangely comforting, really, imagining listeners scattered across different nights, gathering quietly around the same distant fire. The room feels quieter now. I begin to notice how far away the modern world already seems. Long before the Hittite Empire frightened Egypt itself, before royal treaties were pressed into clay tablets, before armies rolled across Syria in clouds of dust, there were simply scattered peoples moving through the rough highlands of Anatolia. Herdsmen, farmers, traders carrying timber, silver, and woven cloth between isolated settlements. Nobody standing there at the beginning could have guessed an empire would rise from these windswept hills. The older city of Hattusa already existed when Indo-European speaking groups slowly entered Anatolia sometime during the early 2nd millennium BCE. Historians still debate exactly how this movement happened. The process was likely gradual rather than dramatic. Families moved, languages blended, customs overlapped. Small kingdoms formed and disappeared with little warning. At night, the settlements must have looked fragile against the darkness. A few lamps glowing behind mud brick walls, dogs barking beyond the gate, smoke slipping upward into freezing air. You can picture a traveller arriving after sunset, his boots coated in pale dust, his donkey exhausted. Maybe he carries tin from the east or wool from the western plains. Maybe he hears 3 different languages before reaching the market square. Anatolia was already tangled with trade routes, rival peoples, and old religious traditions long before the Hittites unified anything. That complexity mattered. The ancient Near East was never isolated kingdoms sitting quietly beside one another. It was movement, constant movement. Copper travelled across mountains. Horses came from distant grasslands. Ideas crossed borders more easily than armies sometimes did. A storm in one kingdom could raise grain prices hundreds of miles away. And through all of this, the future Hittites learned to adapt. Their earliest rulers were not masters of a mighty empire. They were survivors in a difficult political landscape when small kings competed fiercely for resources, labour, and trade access. Loyalty shifted quickly. One bad harvest could weaken an entire dynasty. One assassination during a winter feast might redraw borders by spring. I'll begin to notice how personal ancient politics really were. History books often flatten kingdoms into symbols and dates, but these were intimate worlds. A ruler knew the faces of his bodyguards. Queens negotiated beside smoky hearths while servants listened from dark corners. Messengers arrived breathless at midnight, carrying news capable of destroying entire families before dawn. And always there was the landscape itself. The Anatolian plateau could feel severe even in daylight. Wide grasslands stretched beneath immense skies. Sharp ridges broke the horizon. Cold rivers cut through valleys lined with stubborn trees twisted by wind. In winter, snow covered roads for weeks. Supply wagons vanished in storms. Men froze beside animals they depended upon for survival. The Hittites became experts at endurance because they had little choice. One of the earliest important kings remembered in Hittite tradition was Anita, ruler of Kusara. He lived before the height of Hittite power, during a period when kingdoms fought endlessly for dominance across central Anatolia. His campaigns were brutal and practical. Cities were burned, rivals humiliated, trade routes seized. At one point, according to surviving records, Anita conquered Hattusa itself and cursed the city afterward, warning future rulers never to rebuild it. Naturally, somebody rebuilt it anyway. Human beings rarely resist tempting geography for long. Hattusa sat in a strategically valuable position, surrounded by rocky hills and defensible terrain. Water sources lay nearby. Trade routes passed within reach, even ruined. The place retained a certain stubborn gravity, as though the land itself preferred occupation over silence. After a while, new rulers emerged who began calling their language Nesali, after the city of Nessa. Over time, modern historians would call them Hittites, though the people themselves used several identities depending on context and region. Ancient identity was flexible in ways modern nationalism often struggles to understand. A man might belong to a village, a family, a king, a language group, and a local god simultaneously. Nothing stayed simple for long. The early Hittite kingdom expanded carefully at first. Power spread unevenly through alliances, marriages, intimidation, and war. Some cities submitted peacefully. Others resisted behind thick walls until starvation or betrayal opened the gates. You can almost hear those cities at night. Wooden shutters close tight against cold air, oxen shifting restlessly in narrow pens, children asleep beneath rough woven blankets while adults whisper anxiously nearby about armies rumoured on distant roads. Fear travelled faster than soldiers sometimes. Yet daily life continued regardless of politics. Bread still needed baking, sheep still wandered hillsides, potters still shaped wet clay beside slow fires. Most people living under early Hittite rule probably cared less about imperial ambition than surviving winter with enough grain remaining for spring planting. That ordinary exhaustion sits quietly beneath nearly all ancient history. Kings announced victories carved into stone, but somewhere nearby a farmer worried about a sick mule. Somewhere a mother repaired torn clothing by the weak firelight while snow collected against the outer wall. Somewhere a servant listened carefully during royal banquets because overheard words could mean survival. Without really realizing it, you drift closer to the emotional texture of their world. Not legendary figures yet, not bronze statues, just human beings living under uncertain skies, and in those uncertain skies, the foundations of one of the ancient world's great powers slowly began to take shape. Morning comes slowly to Hattusa. Before sunrise, the city is mostly sound, wind brushing rough stone, a horse stamping inside a narrow stable. Water poured carefully from clay jars. Somewhere in the half-darkness, someone coughs beside a dying fire while servants begin moving through cold corridors with lowered heads and sleepy eyes. The capital does not wake gracefully. It creaks awake. Wooden gates groan open. Smoke thickens above rooftops. Dogs bark at unfamiliar footsteps crossing the outer roads. And beyond the city walls, The Anatolian hills remain grey and enormous beneath the first thin line of dawn. You stand now inside the growing heart of the Hittite kingdom, not yet at its greatest power, not yet the rival of Egypt, but the shape of that future is beginning to emerge from these stone streets and guarded courtyards. Hattusa no longer resembles the ruined settlement cursed generations earlier by Anita. The city has returned stubbornly to life, larger each decade. Climbing across rocky slopes surrounded by defensive walls that follow the difficult terrain like the spine of some sleeping animal. It is an exhausting place to build. The land rises unevenly beneath every structure. Labourers haul stone uphill through mud and snow. Timber must arrive from distant forests. Wells require constant maintenance. Every winter damages something. Every season demands repair. Yet rulers continue building. That alone tells you how important Hattusa has become. The king who truly transformed the city was likely Hattusiliwawa during the 17th century BCE. Even his name ties him directly to the capital itself. He presents himself not merely as a ruler living in Hattusa, but almost as an extension of the city. The relationship between king and capital becomes intimate, symbolic, nearly inseparable. Ancient kings understood architecture emotionally. Walls did not merely defend people, they reassured them. Gates projected confidence. Temples suggested divine favour. A strong city calmed fear, at least briefly, and fear was never far away. The Hittite kingdom still existed among dangerous rivals. To the south lay wealthy Syrian cities tied to long trade traditions. To the east and southeast rose powerful states competing for influence and resources. Internal rebellion remained a constant threat. Royal relatives watched one another carefully. Governors could become traitors surprisingly quickly. No empire begins stable, Hattusili. I spent much of his reign campaigning across Anatolia and northern Syria. His armies marched through mountain passes and dry plains carrying bronze weapons, supplies, and religious symbols tied closely to royal authority. Campaigns were slow, physically miserable affairs. Men slept outdoors beside carts and animals, food spoiled, horses injured themselves on rough terrain. Rain transformed roads into thick brown sludge capable of trapping entire wagons. Victories came at a price measured in exhaustion long before bloodshed. You can imagine soldiers returning north toward Hattusa after months away, dust worked permanently into wool clothing, sandals torn nearly through, faces thinner than before. The relief of seeing city walls again must have felt almost overwhelming. Inside the capital, life continued under constant administrative pressure. Scribes pressed wedge-shaped symbols into damp clay tablets. Priests memorized rituals with nervous precision. Palace workers moved through complicated layers of hierarchy where a single mistake could invite punishment. The Hittites inherited and adapted writing traditions from older Mesopotamian systems. That mattered enormously. Writing allowed rulers to project authority across distance. Orders could travel farther than voices. Treaties survived beyond individual memory. Grain records, tax obligations, diplomatic messages, and legal disputes accumulated tablet by tablet inside royal archives. There is something strangely intimate about those surviving tablets now. Many are not grand declarations. Some concern missing livestock, religious procedures, or political complaints phrased with very human frustration. Ancient bureaucracy rarely sounds heroic. Mostly it sounds tired. A governor apologizes. A priest requests clarification. A king grows irritated. The emotional texture feels unexpectedly familiar. And above this administrative machinery stood the royal household itself, tense and vulnerable despite appearances of strength. The palace at Hattusa was not a peaceful residence. It was a place of negotiations, suspicion, ritual obligation, and constant observation. Listened, relatives calculated, Messengers arrived at inconvenient hours carrying unwelcome news. You begin to notice how little privacy powerful people possessed in the ancient world. Meals were political, marriages were strategic, religious ceremonies reinforced authority publicly and repeatedly because power required constant performance. If a king appeared weak, uncertainty spread quickly through the kingdom. That uncertainty could become deadly. Hittite succession was not always orderly. Rival claimants emerged. Brothers distrusted one another. Sons disappointed fathers. Assassination and removal remained entirely possible outcomes during moments of instability. Later texts would remember periods of violence within the royal family with visible discomfort. No dynasty ever feels as permanent from the inside as it appears later in history books. Outside the palace, ordinary residents crowded into workshops and homes built from mud brick, timber, and stone foundations. Bakers prepared coarse bread before sunrise. Metal workers hammered. Bronze tools beside intense heat. Children carried water uphill through narrow streets while older men argued over trade or weather predictions near market areas. The city smelled of animals constantly. Donkeys, horses, sheep brought temporarily inside the walls. Leather drying beside workshops, smoke from cooking fires mixing with damp earth after rain. And always there were the gods. Hattusa filled gradually with temples and sacred spaces dedicated to a growing collection of deities gathered from across conquered territories. The Hittites absorbed religious traditions readily. Storm gods, sun goddesses, local spirits, protective deities tied to rivers or mountains, all entered the expanding spiritual landscape of the kingdom. Religion was not distant from daily life. It shaped politics, harvests, illness, diplomacy, and war. If storms damaged crops, divine anger might be blamed. If military campaigns succeeded, proper rituals likely received credit. Priests watched for signs constantly because the universe itself felt unstable and alive with intention. At night, ceremonies flickered behind temple walls while oil lamps trembled in the wind. Somewhere nearby, exhausted guards leaned against cold stone with spears resting loosely in tired hands. Somewhere scribes continued working by dim light because royal administration never entirely slept. Somewhere in the palace, a ruler stared across maps and tribute lists, wondering which neighbouring kingdom might betray him next. Hattusa was becoming something larger than a fortified city. It was becoming the nervous centre of an expanding political organism, pulling distant territories slowly into its orbit through force, negotiation, fear, and necessity. And without fully realising it, the people living there had already begun building one of the great powers of the Bronze Age world. The royal court of the Hittites is quieter than you might expect. Not silent, never silent. Sandaled feet pass constantly across stone floors. Bronze cups touch wooden tables. Fabric rustles in narrow corridors. Somewhere a servant whispers urgently before disappearing behind a heavy doorway. Yet beneath all this movement sits a careful restraint, as though everyone understands how dangerous careless words can become inside a palace. Especially at night, firelight changes people after sunset. Faces soften and sharpen unpredictably. Conversations lower into cautious murmurs. The long shadows inside Hattusa seem to listen. You'll begin to understand that power here depends less on spectacle than on fragile human trust, or the appearance of trust. By the 16th century BCE, the Hittite kingdom has grown stronger, more ambitious, and far more politically complicated. Victories abroad bring wealth, captives, livestock, tribute, and prestige into Hattusa. They also bring tension. Expansion creates opportunity for rivals. Royal authority stretches farther across Anatolia and northern Syria, but distance makes loyalty harder to control. A governor days away from the capital might obey the king completely, or not at all. The royal family itself sits at the centre of this uncertainty. Hittite kings rule with military authority, religious responsibility, and personal charisma tightly woven together. A weak ruler threatens more than politics. He threatens cosmic balance itself. At least that is how royal ideology presents the matter, which places unbearable pressure upon ordinary human beings. A king wakes tired, a king grows ill, a king mistrusts his sons. None of this disappears simply because palace scribes describe him as favoured by the gods. One surviving text from Hattusa reveals startling emotional honesty for the ancient world. Near the end of his reign, he openly criticizes members of his own family while discussing succession problems. The tone feels wounded, frustrated, almost exhausted. You can sense an aging ruler discovering that blood loyalty rarely behaves as neatly as political theory promises. Dynasty is a deeply personal thing. A son is never only a son. He is also a possible successor, rival, disappointment, or threat. Queens carried immense influence within this atmosphere. The Hittite royal court gave elite women unusually visible political and religious roles compared with some neighbouring states. The queen participated actively in ceremonies, diplomacy, and administration. Her position endured significance even after her husband's death. This mattered because continuity mattered. A stable queen could steady a fragile transition between kings. You can picture her moving through temple courts before dawn, wrapped against cold air while priests prepare offerings nearby. Servants lower their eyes as she passes. Foreign envoys study her carefully for clues about court politics. Every gesture carries meaning. Nothing inside the palace remains purely private for long. Marriage itself becomes political architecture. Royal daughters marry foreign rulers or allied nobles. Sons marry strategically chosen women, tied to influential families or regions. Affection may exist within these arrangements. Sometimes genuine tenderness likely emerged, but politics always sleeps nearby, listening through the walls. There is a lonely quality to that kind of life. Imagine eating every meal while observers study your expression. Imagine knowing a poorly chosen sentence might reshape alliances across entire regions. Even children born into the palace inherit invisible burdens immediately. Outside the royal compounds, ordinary families experience hierarchy differently but no less intimately. Loyalty oaths bind officials to the crown through religious and legal obligations. These oaths were serious matters. The Hittites believed broken promises could invite divine punishment upon entire households. The language of treaties often feels deeply emotional, not merely legal. Loyalty is described almost as a sacred relationship between people watched constantly by the gods. Betrayal carries spiritual contamination as well as political danger. That emotional intensity helped hold the kingdom together across difficult terrain and competing local identities. Still, fear lingered beneath the surface. Court conspiracies were not abstract possibilities. They happened. Assassinations disrupted succession. Ambitious relatives maneuvered quietly for influence. Some kings rose through unstable circumstances that later generations tried carefully to justify or obscure. History written by royal scribes often resembles careful emotional repair work. Embarrassment fade conveniently into silence. Others survive only in fragments. I begin to notice how incomplete ancient memory really is. A broken tablet, a damaged seal. A few surviving lines scratched into clay before fire destroyed the archive centuries later. Modern historians reconstruct entire dynasties from these scattered remains with extraordinary patience, though uncertainty never fully disappears. And perhaps that uncertainty feels appropriate. The people inside Hattusa rarely understood their own future clearly either. One winter evening, the palace might feel secure and prosperous. Musicians perform softly during a banquet, while bronze lamps flicker against painted walls. Imported wine passes between guests. Outside, snow gathers silently along the fortifications. Then a messenger arrives, a rebellion in the south, a failed harvest, an ally changing sides. Everything shifts again. The Hittites became skilled administrators, partly because instability forced them to become practical. They developed legal systems, diplomatic traditions, and military organization capable of holding together a remarkably diverse kingdom. Local rulers often retained some authority beneath Hittite oversight, creating a flexible imperial structure. Rigid control was impossible across such distances. Compromise became essential. This flexibility distinguished the Hittites from some neighboring powers. They absorbed local customs instead of erasing them completely. Conquered peoples frequently kept their own gods, traditions, and internal structures, so long as a tribute arrived and loyalty remained intact. Empire, in practice, often meant negotiation more than domination. Of course, negotiation backed by armies remains negotiation of a particular kind. The Hittite military continued expanding during these generations. Chariots grew increasingly important. Horses became symbols of both prestige and strategic power. Training them required specialized knowledge and enormous resources. Manuals for horse training survive from the Hittite world. Surprisingly detailed and methodical. You can almost smell the skills. Warm animal breath rising into cold morning air, damp straw beneath heavy hooves, stable workers rubbing sore muscles after long training exercises. Chariot warfare may appear glamorous from a distance, but up close it depended upon relentless labor and exhausted animals. Most great empires rest ultimately upon logistics and tired people. As evening settles again over Hattusa, oil lamps glow behind shuttered windows across the city. Priests complete final rituals inside temple courtyards. Guards trade places along the walls. Somewhere a queen speaks quietly with trusted attendants about succession worries nobody else must overhear. Somewhere else, a young prince lies awake listening to winter wind against stone, already understanding that one day the weight of the kingdom may settle heavily upon his own shoulders. The horses hear the tension before the men do. They shift restlessly in darkness before dawn, leather straps creaking softly as stable workers move between them, carrying lamps protected from the wind by careful hands. The air smells of damp hay, cold mud, sweat dried into wool blankets, and the sharp animal heat rising steadily from the stalls. Outside the walls of Hattusa, the world remains blue and silent for another few moments. Then somewhere across the camp a bronze trumpet sounds. Not dramatic, not glorious, just practical and low in the freezing morning air. The Hittite kingdom is becoming an empire now, and empires move on roads filled with exhausted people, frightened animals, broken wheels, and endless uncertainty. The romantic image of ancient warfare disappears quickly once you stand close enough to smell it properly. I begin to notice how heavy everything is. Bronze armor, spears, grain sacks, chariot frames, water jars, wet clothing after rain. Every mile travelled by a Bronze Age army demanded astonishing physical effort from humans and animals alike. Still, the Hittites kept marching. By the 15th and 14th centuries BCE, Hittite rulers expanded aggressively across Anatolia and into Syria, transforming themselves into one of the great powers of the ancient Near East. Their rivals understood the danger immediately. Trade routes, silver resources, fertile lands, and strategic cities all lay within contested territory. Control meant survival, and survival rarely encouraged gentleness. The Hittite army developed into a formidable military force built around disciplined infantry and increasingly sophisticated chariot warfare. Their chariots differed somewhat from Egyptian models. Hittite vehicles were often heavier and carried more men, sacrificing some speed for greater striking power during close combat, at least in theory. In reality, battlefields dissolved quickly into confusion. Dust blinded men, horses panicked. Orders vanished beneath noise and fear. A carefully planned formation could collapse entirely after one badly timed maneuver or sudden terrain problem. Ancient warfare depended heavily upon morale because communication remained painfully limited once fighting began. Imagine standing there before battle. Dry wind against your face, the taste of dust already gathering inside your mouth. Ahead, distant movement across the plain. Hundreds of men you do not know preparing to kill you because rulers far away have argued over tribute, borders, or loyalty. Most soldiers were not legendary warriors. They were ordinary men carrying fear inside tired bodies. That truth sits quietly beneath every military victory. Hittite kings presented themselves as powerful commanders favored by the gods. Royal inscriptions celebrated conquest, tribute, and divine support, yet surviving records occasionally reveal flashes of the chaos underneath official propaganda. Campaigns failed. Weather disrupted movements. Allies betrayed agreements. Entire operations slowed because supply systems struggled across difficult terrain. Even successful armies spent enormous energy simply avoiding starvation. The roads through Anatolia and Syria could be brutal depending on season. Summer heat drained men and animals rapidly. Winter storms isolated units for weeks. Rivers flooded unexpectedly. Wagons snapped axles on rocky paths. Grain spoiled in damp conditions. You can picture soldiers sleeping beside weak fires after endless marching. Boots stiff with mud, shoulders aching beneath equipment that never grows lighter no matter how long you carry it. And still the officers wake them before sunrise. The expansion southward into Syria changed the Hittite kingdom permanently. Syrian cities were wealthier, older, and more deeply connected to international trade networks than much of central Anatolia. Fine textiles, luxury goods, scribal traditions, and diplomatic culture flowed through these regions. Conquest brought admiration alongside violence. The Hittites did not simply destroy the cultures they encountered. They absorbed techniques, gods, administrative practices, and artistic influences readily. Empire became a process of accumulation as much as domination. This made the Hittite world feel layered and surprisingly cosmopolitan. Inside conquered cities, merchants spoke multiple languages. Scribes translated treaties between kingdoms. Foreign craftsmen worked under Hittite oversight while local elites negotiated carefully to preserve status beneath imperial authority. No border remained emotionally simple. A city conquered one year might provide loyal soldiers the next, or rebellion, often both at different moments. One important ruler during this period was Tudalia, part of a line of kings struggling to maintain momentum amid constant external threats. The kingdom faced pressure not only from Beria but from western Anatolia and powerful neighbours like Mitanni, a major state dominating northern Mesopotamia and Syria for generations. The rivalry with Mitanni shaped much of Hittite military strategy. These were not isolated clashes between distant civilizations. Royal families intermarried, diplomats travelled constantly. Trade continued even during periods of hostility. Political relationships shifted with exhausting regularity. A trusted ally one season could become a battlefield enemy by the next harvest. I begin to understand why treaties mattered so much. The Hittites became highly skilled diplomats partly because warfare alone could not sustain such a complicated imperial environment. Vassal agreements established obligations between rulers and subordinate states, often reinforced through religious oaths and mutual promises of protection, though beneath the formal language lingered obvious realities. Submit willingly or face military consequences. Still, many local rulers likely preferred negotiated Hittite oversight to complete destruction. Ancient survival often involved choosing the least dangerous master available. At Hattusa itself, victories abroad transformed the atmosphere of the capital. Tribute arrived from distant regions. Foreign envoys entered ceremonial gates carrying gifts and anxious expressions. Royal archives expanded steadily with treaties, inventories, and correspondence. The city felt larger now, busier, more crowded with ambition. Yet success brought strain as well. Maintaining armies in distant territories required enormous administrative effort. Taxes increased, labour demands intensified, provincial loyalty needed constant reinforcement. The machinery of empire consumed resources endlessly. Somewhere in the city tonight. A blacksmith still works late, repairing damaged bronze fittings beneath flickering firelight. Somewhere a stable worker rubs down exhausted horses after weeks on campaign roads. Somewhere a captured prisoner stares silently into darkness, far from home, listening to unfamiliar voices drift through cold Anatolian air. Empires are built from countless private sorrows rarely recorded officially, and as Hittite power stretches farther across the ancient world, those sorrows will multiply alongside triumphs. By the time darkness settles fully over Hattusa, the temples begin to glow. Not brightly, nothing in the Bronze Age is truly bright after sunset. Light comes in trembling pools cast by oil lamps, resin torches, and low ceremonial fires that bend and flicker in the night wind. Stone walls breathe out the day's stored warmth slowly. Incense smoke drifts through narrow courtyards somewhere nearby. A priest murmurs words repeated so many times, they have become almost rhythmic enough to disappear into breathing itself. The city feels different at night, more uncertain, more sacred. The Hittites lived inside a crowded spiritual world. Gods watched storms gather above mountains. Gods listened at treaties. Gods entered battlefields. Harvests, illnesses, royal marriages, and household disputes, nothing existed entirely outside divine attention. To modern minds, religion often appears separate from ordinary life. For the Hittites, separation would have felt impossible. Even politics carried ritual weight, especially politics. The Hittites eventually became known for worshipping what later texts described as the 1,000 gods of Hatti. The phrase was partly symbolic, but not entirely exaggerated. As the kingdom expanded, local deities from conquered or allied regions entered the Hittite religious system. Storm gods from one city stood beside sun goddesses from another, Hurrian deities mixed with older Anatolian traditions. Sacred identities overlapped rather than replacing one another cleanly. Empire widened the heavens, and the Hittites seemed comfortable with contradiction. A ruler might honor several versions of a storm god without seeing inconsistency. Religious flexibility helped stabilize conquered territories. If local populations could continue worshipping familiar deities under Hittite authority, resistance sometimes softened into uneasy cooperation. Practicality and belief often walked together. Inside the great temple districts of Hattusa, priests and priestesses managed an exhausting cycle of rituals designed to preserve harmony between humanity and the divine world. Offerings had to occur properly. Sacred objects required careful maintenance. Festivals followed strict calendars. Mistakes worried people deeply because disasters might follow ritual neglect. A failed harvest could become evidence of divine anger. So could plague, so could military defeat. You can imagine the pressure resting upon temple officials during difficult years. One missed procedure, one forgotten offering, one incorrectly spoken prayer in anxious times. People search desperately for reasons behind suffering. Some things never change much across history. The temples themselves were active, physical places rather than silent spaces for private contemplation. Animals arrived for sacrifice. Musicians performed during ceremonies. Servants cleaned floors, prepared offerings, and carried water through crowded courtyards. The gods required feeding symbolically through bread, beer, wine, grain, and meat presented ritually before sacred statues. The divine needed maintenance. That idea feels strangely intimate. A neglected god might become dangerous. A properly honored one might protect the kingdom another season. During major festivals, entire sections of the city transformed. Processions moved through streets lined with spectators wrapped against cold morning air. Priests carried sacred objects beneath embroidered cloth. Royal officials followed in carefully arranged order, while musicians played drums and pipes echoing against stone walls. Children likely loved the spectacle. adults probably worried constantly about performing everything correctly. One important religious celebration was the Tak Sum festival, tied to seasonal renewal and royal legitimacy. Such ceremonies reinforced political order alongside spiritual belief. The king himself participated actively because his role included maintaining divine favor for the kingdom. A ruler who neglected ritual obligations risked more than personal criticism. He risked cosmic instability. That burden must have felt exhausting after a while. Imagine leading armies for months across dangerous territory, then returning immediately into elaborate ceremonies requiring absolute concentration while priests watch your every movement for errors. And still the kingdom expects calm confidence. The royal family occupied a uniquely sacred position within Hittite society. Kings often served as chief priests during major rituals. Queens also held important religious authority, especially the Tuanana, the chief queen whose ceremonial role could continue even after her husband's death. This sometimes created tension inside the court. A new king's wife might find herself overshadowed by the surviving queen of the previous reign, who still retained enormous ritual influence. Ancient politics became deeply tangled with sacred hierarchy. Even grief carried administrative complications. The gods themselves reflected the emotional realities of Anatolian life. Storm gods mattered enormously in a land dependent upon uncertain weather. Sun deities offered stability and justice. Protective gods guarded boundaries, rivers, fertility, and royal authority. I began to notice how grounded these beliefs were in physical survival. Rain meant grain. Grain meant life. A violent storm could nourish fields or destroy them entirely within hours. Of course, people imagined divine personalities behind such unpredictable forces, standing beneath immense skies without modern forecasting technology. The weather must have felt alive with intention. At night in the countryside, villagers probably listened carefully to distant thunder rolling across the hills, wondering whether the gods were pleased or furious. Divination became another important part of Hittite religious practice. Priests interpreted signs through dreams, animal entrails, celestial observations, and ritual procedures designed to uncover divine intentions. Kings consulted oracles before military campaigns and political decisions. Not because ancient people were foolish, because uncertainty is frightening. Human beings have always searched for reassurance before dangerous choices. One surviving prayer from the Hittite world feels strikingly personal in its tone. A ruler pleads with the gods during plague and suffering, questioning what offense caused such punishment. The language sounds weary and vulnerable rather than triumphant. You can almost hear the fatigue behind the formal words. Empires often appear powerful from a distance. Up close, they are filled with anxious people trying desperately to avoid disaster. As evening deepens over Hattusa, temple fires continue burning steadily against the cold. Priests complete final offerings while guards patrol nearby walls beneath darkening skies. In the city, an exhausted mother whispers a quiet prayer over a feverish child. Somewhere else, a king studies troubling omens beside flickering lamplight, wondering whether the gods still favor his reign. And above them all, beyond smoke and stone and winter wind, the ancient Anatolian stars remain cold and silent. The road south from Hattusa feels endless in spring. Wagon wheels sink into wet earth. Horses breathe clouds into the cold morning air. Rain lingers inside cloaks long after storms pass, leaving wool heavy against the shoulders and the smell of damp leather following every movement. Somewhere ahead, beyond the mountains and river valleys, lie the wealthy cities of Syria, where trade routes braid together beneath crowded walls, and every ruler watches his neighbors with practiced suspicion. The Hittites are moving toward that world now with increasing determination, and the world is watching them back. By the 14th century BCE, the ancient Near East has become a dense network of rival powers balanced uneasily against one another. Egypt dominates the south under ambitious pharaohs. Mitanni controls much of northern Mesopotamia and Syria through alliances and military influence. Babylon still carries immense cultural prestige even during periods of political weakness. Assyria waits restlessly at the edges, not yet supreme, but growing sharper each generation. Between them lie contested cities, exhausted farmers and nervous merchants, and roads full of rumours. I begin to understand how international this Bronze Age world already was. Diplomats travel constantly. Royal daughters marry across borders. Gifts move between kingdoms and carefully measured displays of friendship and status. Tin from distant mines becomes bronze in workshops hundreds of miles away. Grain shortages in one region affect prices elsewhere. Nothing stays isolated for long. The Hittites expand southward directly into this fragile balance. Syrian cities matter enormously because they control trade, taxation, and strategic movement between Anatolia and the richer lands farther south. Whoever dominates Syria gains wealth and political leverage far beyond the region itself, which means Syria rarely experiences peace for very long. The struggle against Mitanni becomes especially important during this period. Mitanni is a sophisticated and influential kingdom with strong military traditions and extensive diplomatic connections. For generations it had acted as a major power across northern Syria, often limiting Hittite ambitions. Now the balance begins to crack. Hittite rulers push harder into contested territory through campaigns, treaties, intimidation, and opportunistic alliances with dissatisfied local rulers. Some cities submit willingly when Hittite armies approach. Others resist behind thick defensive walls, hoping rival powers will intervene before supplies run out. Sometimes help arrives, sometimes it does not. Sieges in the Bronze Age were long, hungry affairs. Armies surrounded cities while waiting for fear, starvation, or betrayal to open gates more effectively than direct assault ever could. Disease spread easily among crowded camps. Tempers frayed. Water sources became precious. You can picture soldiers crouched beside weak fires outside some distant Syrian city, while rain taps softly against shields stacked nearby. Weeks pass, then months. Men gamble with carved bone pieces, complain about food, sharpen bronze blades already sharpened too many times before. Empires spend much of their existence waiting. Inside the besieged cities, life narrows painfully. Grain rationing begins. Wells are watched carefully. Civilians listen for signs of assault during sleepless nights. Children grow quiet from hunger. Leaders argue privately about surrender terms nobody wishes to discuss openly. The emotional pressure of siege warfare must have been immense, and still diplomacy continues even during conflict. One of the remarkable things about this era is how personal international politics often became kings addressed one another as brother in diplomatic correspondence when relations were friendly or strategically useful. Gifts carried emotional symbolism alongside material value. A slight insult during negotiations could damage alliances for years. Human pride travelled everywhere with these empires. The Hittites learned to navigate this world with increasing confidence. Their rulers developed reputations as capable negotiators willing to combine military force with calculated flexibility. Local rulers who submitted might retain authority beneath Hittite oversight. Those who rebelled repeatedly faced harsher consequences. Practicality guided most decisions. Ideology mattered less than stability. At Hattusa, the effects of southern expansion became visible throughout the capital. Foreign envoys arrive wearing unfamiliar clothing and speaking different languages. Luxury goods entered royal storerooms. Hurrian cultural influence spread deeply through religion, music, literature, and court life. The empire absorbs while it conquers. You can hear it in the city now, multiple languages drifting through market spaces, Syrian merchants negotiating beside Anatolian craftsmen, scribes copying foreign names carefully into clay records while trying not to make expensive mistakes. No great empire remains culturally pure for long, and the Hittites never seemed especially interested in purity anyway. Still, expansion carried enormous strain beneath outward success. Maintaining authority across distant territories required loyal governors, reliable communication, military readiness, and functioning supply systems. A rebellion in Syria might take weeks to fully understand back in Hattusa. By then, the situation could already have changed completely. Ancient governments moved at the speed of horses and weather. That limitation shaped everything. A storm delaying messengers could alter military decisions. A flooded river might isolate entire regions temporarily. One assassination during a diplomatic banquet could unravel years of careful alliance building. The emotional atmosphere of imperial politics remained permanently tense because information arrived slowly and often incompletely. Kings ruled partly through uncertainty. Somewhere tonight, inside a Syrian palace, a local ruler studies conflicting rumors about approaching Hittite armies while musicians play softly in another room for guests pretending not to worry somewhere else. A Hittite commander writes reports beside flickering lamplight while exhausted horses stand tethered outside in cold rain. And far away in Hattusa, temple fires continue burning against the darkness as priests pray for victory, stability, and another season without catastrophe. But the Bronze Age world is growing more dangerous now. The rivalries deepening across Syria will soon pull the Hittites into direct confrontation with the greatest powers on earth. Victory arrives in Hattusa wearing the smell of smoke, sweat, and sickness. Messengers reach the city first, then supply wagons, then wounded men wrapped in dusty cloaks stiffened by old blood and hard travel. Chariots roll through the gates with cracked wheels and exhausted horses whose ribs show faintly beneath dull coats. Crowds gather to watch the returning army, but the cheering feels uncertain this time. Too many faces are missing. By the middle of the 14th century BCE, the Hittite kingdom stands under the rule of one of its most formidable kings, Suppiluliuma. Even now, historians speak his name with a certain careful respect. He was brilliant, ambitious, adaptable, and relentless in ways that reshaped the balance of power across the Near East. But greatness in ancient history often leaves a bitter taste nearby. Suppiluliuma inherited a kingdom already expanding aggressively. Though not always securely, rivals surrounded the Hittites. Internal instability remained possible. Foreign alliances shifted constantly, yet under his leadership, the kingdom transformed into a genuine imperial superpower capable of challenging any state in the region. You can feel the confidence growing during his reign. Campaign after campaign pushes Hittite authority farther south and east. Mitanni weakens under pressure from internal disputes and external enemies. Suppiluliuma exploits those fractures skillfully, seizing territory and installing loyal rulers where possible. Syrian cities fall into Hittite orbit one after another, not all through violence. Some submit strategically, calculating survival with cold realism. Ancient diplomacy often resembled weather forecasting. Leaders watched the direction of power carefully and adjusted before storms fully arrived. Suppiluliuma excelled at creating the sense that resistance was becoming hopeless. His armies moved repeatedly through Syria, consolidating control over wealthy urban centers and crucial trade networks. Carchemish became especially important, eventually ruled by the members of the royal family themselves. The Hittite Empire now stretched far beyond the Anatolian plateau that had first shaped it. The kingdom feels larger now, richer, more dangerous. Inside Hattusa, foreign influence deepens further. Hurrian culture permeates court life and religion. International correspondence fills the royal archives. Scribes work constantly recording treaties, inventories, diplomatic agreements, and military reports. The empire begins to resemble a complicated machine requiring endless attention. And at the center sits Suppiluliuma, carrying the exhaustion of constant command. It's easy to imagine ancient kings as distant figures carved from certainty, but surviving evidence suggests something far more human. Rulers travelled relentlessly. They managed military campaigns, diplomacy, religious duties, succession concerns, and internal politics simultaneously. Decisions carried enormous consequences, often with incomplete information. There must have been nights when Suppiluliuma barely slept. One crisis ended, another arrived before dawn. Then came Egypt. The great powers of the Bronze Age had circled one another carefully for generations, but now events pulled the Hittites and Egyptians into direct diplomatic entanglement through one of the strangest episodes in ancient history. After the death of the Egyptian pharaoh, likely Tutankhamun, a widowed Egyptian queen sent a message to Suppiluliuma requesting a Hittite prince as husband. The surviving Hittite accounts present the king as deeply suspicious at first. The proposal sounded unbelievable, an Egyptian queen asking a foreign ruler for marriage. It violated normal diplomatic expectations entirely. Suppiluliuma hesitated. Investigations followed. More messages arrived insisting the request was genuine. Eventually he agreed to send one of his sons, Prince Zananza, toward Egypt for the marriage alliance. The prince never arrived. Somewhere on the journey south he was killed. Accounts differ regarding responsibility. The truth remains uncertain. Egyptian court intrigue likely played a role. Suppiluliuma reacted with fury. The emotional shock seems to have cut deeply into the royal household. You can almost picture the moment the news reaches Hattusa, a messenger kneeling breathlessly before the king, the room falling silent, firelight moving against stone walls while nobody speaks for several long seconds. Ancient diplomacy could become intensely personal very quickly. Suppiluliuma launched military retaliation into Syrian territories connected with Egyptian influence. Prisoners were taken back north into Hittite lands, and with them came something invisible: plague. The disease spread devastatingly through the Hittite kingdom. Modern scholars still debate its exact nature, but its effects were catastrophic. Soldiers carried infection home through military movement and prisoner transport. Towns suffered. Families vanished. Administrative systems weakened beneath repeated waves of death. Even the royal family could not escape. Suppiluliuma himself eventually died during the plague, along with his successor Anuwandithek soon afterward. After years of victory, expansion, and rising imperial confidence, the kingdom suddenly stood surrounded by grief. There is something painfully recognizable about that transition. Human beings often imagine power can insulate them from vulnerability. Then disease moves quietly through crowded rooms and reminds everyone otherwise. Inside Hattusa, daily life must have changed completely during the plague years. Fear enters ordinary routines. Servants avoid one another nervously. Priests perform desperate rituals seeking divine mercy. Funeral ceremonies multiply. Some houses remain dark and shuttered for days. The city grows quieter, not peaceful quieter, the quieter of absence. Some surviving Hittite prayers from this period sound raw with confusion and desperation. Rulers ask the gods why punishment has fallen upon the kingdom. They search for forgotten offences, broken oaths, neglected rituals. Suffering demands explanation, especially when it arrives at such scale. But no clear answer comes. Only more funerals, and still the empire survives. Barely, perhaps. Uneasily. Yet it survives long enough for new rulers to inherit both its extraordinary power and its accumulating burdens. A's night settles again over Hattusa. Smoke rises from temple fires into cold Anatolian darkness. Somewhere a grieving mother sits awake beside fading embers while distant bells echo softly through the city. Somewhere in the palace, surviving officials continue their work because administration cannot entirely stop even during catastrophe. And beyond the walls, The empire Suppiluliuma built waits uncertainly beneath enormous silent skies. The letters arrive sealed in clay and dust. They travel for weeks across rough roads, river crossings, mountain passes, and dangerous stretches of open country where bandits watch trade caravans from distant ridges. By the time they reach Hattusa, the tablets already carry the physical exhaustion of the journey, corners chipped, surfaces scratched lightly by handling, traces of foreign soil pressed into the edges. A scribe receives them carefully. Nothing moves an empire more quietly than writing. By the 13th century BCE, the Hittite world has become deeply entangled in international diplomacy. Armies still matter. Of course, chariots still thunder across plains when negotiations fail. But increasingly, kingdoms survive through correspondence. Marriages, trade agreements, hostage exchanges, and fragile understandings maintained line by line upon clay tablets. The ancient world is learning how exhausting peace can become. Inside the archives at Hattusa, thousands of tablets accumulate over generations. Some contain treaties, others preserve prayers, legal judgments, inventories, myths, and diplomatic exchanges with foreign courts. The rooms themselves likely smelled of clay dust, smoke, lamp oil, and damp wool carried inside on winter clothing. You can imagine scribes hunched over low tables long after sunset, wrists aching while they press wedge-shaped symbols into soft clay with patient concentration. One mistake might alter tribute obligations or insult a foreign ruler unintentionally. The emotional tone of these letters feels surprisingly modern sometimes. Kings complain, allies make excuses, officials apologize for delays. One ruler politely requests gold while subtly implying disappointment at previous gifts. Human beings remain remarkably recognizable across 3,000 years. The Hittites communicate regularly with Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, and smaller kingdoms spread across Syria and the Levant. Diplomacy becomes intensely personal because political systems still revolve around individual rulers and their households. Trust depends upon relationships between specific human beings rather than abstract institutions. That makes every misunderstanding dangerous. A delayed gift may suggest disrespect. A poorly phrased message may imply hostility. A marriage alliance may calm tensions temporarily while creating new anxieties elsewhere. You'll begin to notice how emotionally fragile international order really is. One of the most fascinating aspects of Bronze Age diplomacy is the language of familial closeness used between rulers. Powerful kings call one another brother as a sign of equality and mutual recognition. Lesser rulers address stronger kings as father or lord. The wording matters enormously. Status hides inside every phrase. A foreign envoy entering Hattusa must navigate these invisible hierarchies carefully. He arrives tired from travel, carrying gifts selected with political precision. Fine textiles, perhaps, horses, precious metal vessels, exotic woods, maybe carefully trained servants intended as displays of wealth and goodwill. Then begin the ceremonies, banquets, formal greetings, negotiations stretching late into the night while musicians perform softly nearby and interpreters move anxiously between languages. The palace atmosphere during such meetings must have felt thick with calculation. Everyone else. A smile lasts slightly too long, a gift receives insufficient admiration, a seating arrangement causes offense. Entire regional relationships might shift because exhausted diplomats misread one another after weeks of travel and too much ceremonial wine. And still they continue negotiating because the alternative is often war. One Hittite king deeply involved in this diplomatic world is Mu'talib, though the patterns surrounding him began earlier and continue afterward as well. Under rulers like him, the empire functions less as an isolated kingdom and more as one participant within a crowded international system balancing fear, ambition, and necessity. This system produces extraordinary political complexity. Vassal rulers in Syria write urgently to Hattusa requesting military aid against rivals. Egyptian officials monitor Hittite expansion nervously. Assyria grows steadily more assertive in the east. Local rebellions flare unexpectedly. Every letter arriving at the palace carries potential consequences, sometimes terrible ones. The emotional burden placed upon royal administrators must have been immense. Imagine trying to govern distant territories without rapid communication. By the time news arrives, situations may already have transformed entirely. A city requesting help could already be conquered. An ally promising loyalty might secretly negotiate elsewhere simultaneously. Ancient diplomacy required enormous patience mixed with constant suspicion, and beneath all these negotiations lived ordinary people adapting to imperial politics they could not control. A merchant waits anxiously for roads to reopen after border tensions. Farmers wonder whether armies will trample spring fields during another campaign season. Interpreters spend their lives moving between languages and loyalties, never fully belonging anywhere. Empires create entire classes of people skilled at uncertainty. In the Syrian cities under Hittite influence, cultural blending deepens further. Local traditions survive beneath imperial oversight. Hittite administrators work alongside regional elites. Religious festivals continue with subtle adaptations. Markets fill with goods traveling astonishing distances across interconnected trade routes. The Bronze Age world feels almost delicate in its complexity now. Tin from far away becomes bronze weapons in Anatolia. Grain from one region feeds soldiers in another. Diplomatic marriages tie courts together emotionally even when political trust weaken. Everything depends upon the movement, and movement always remains vulnerable. At night in Hattusa, scribes continue copying treaties beside flickering oil lamps while winter wind presses softly against outer walls. Somewhere nearby, an exhausted messenger sleeps heavily after delivering urgent correspondence from Syria. His boots dry slowly beside the fire. His horse stands in the stable below, sides still trembling faintly from the long road. Tomorrow more letters will arrive, more requests, more warnings, more carefully phrased reassurances between rulers who fear one another almost as much as they need one another's. And somewhere far south along the Nile, Egyptian officials are already watching Hittite power rise with growing unease. Knowing the balance between the great kingdoms cannot remain stable forever. The dust arrives before the armies do. It hangs first along the horizon in pale shifting bands beneath the Syrian sun, stirred upward by thousands of feet. Wheels, horses, and supply animals moving steadily toward one another across the plains near Kadesh. From a distance, the scene almost looks unreal, softened by heat and distance until banners blur into wavering colour against the light. Then the sound begins reaching you. Harness chains rattling softly, drivers shouting at nervous horses, wooden wheels grinding over dry ground, men coughing dust from their throats before battle has even started. By the late 13th century BCE, tension between the Hittite Empire and Egypt has hardened into direct military confrontation. Kadesh, a strategically valuable city near the Orontes River, becomes the center of that struggle. Control of Syria matters too much for either power to retreat comfortably, and so two of the ancient world's greatest empires move toward collision beneath an unforgiving sky. The Hittite king Mu'attali commands a vast coalition force drawn from across his empire and allied territories. Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II marches north, determined to restore Egyptian authority and personal prestige. Both rulers understand the symbolic weight of this confrontation long before battle begins. Neither can afford humiliation. The armies themselves are enormous by Bronze Age standards. Chariot units dominate military planning, supported by infantry, camp followers, supply teams, servants, and animals stretching across miles of difficult terrain. Ancient campaigns were entire moving societies held together by discipline and momentum. And exhaustion. Always exhaustion. You can imagine the Egyptian soldiers sleeping lightly beside the river before dawn. Sweat dried into linen clothing after long marches through summer heat. Nearby, Hittite forces wait in tense silence beyond the hills. Horses watered carefully. Bronze weapons checked repeatedly by hands already slick with dust and nervousness. Some men pray quietly, others joke too loudly because fear needs somewhere to go. The Battle of Kadesh itself unfolds through confusion, misinformation, sudden violence, and near disaster. Egyptian accounts later portray Ramesses as a heroic figure, standing bravely against overwhelming odds after his forces are surprised by hidden Hittite troops. Hittite records survive less fully, though modern historians generally agree the battle ended inconclusively despite Egyptian claims of glorious victory. The reality view was likely chaotic beyond neat political storytelling. Mu'tali positioned significant portions of his army behind Kadesh itself, concealed from Egyptian reconnaissance. Egyptian forces advanced in separated divisions, vulnerable before fully concentrating. Then Hittite chariots struck suddenly. The attack shattered parts of the Egyptian camp. For a while, complete collapse may have seemed possible. You can almost hear the terror of those first moments. Horses screaming, men trampled beneath wheels, dust so thick commanders lose sight of their own formations. Orders vanish beneath noise and panic. Battlefields destroy clarity very quickly. Ancient royal inscriptions describe triumph because rulers needed triumph politically, but standing inside the actual fighting must have felt far less glorious. Just heat, confusion, thirst, fear, and desperate survival measured minute by minute. Some soldiers likely never even saw the opposing king. They fought whoever appeared suddenly through the dust carrying a spear. The Hittite Chariot Corps performed impressively during the battle, demonstrating the military sophistication the empire had developed over generations. Their heavier chariots delivered powerful shock attacks capable of destabilizing enemy positions rapidly. Yet success became difficult to control. Some Hittite troops reportedly began looting the Egyptian camp prematurely instead of fully consolidating victory. Human beings remain vulnerable to distraction even during decisive moments. That pause allowed Ramesses and surviving Egyptian units time to regroup. Momentum shifted again. It always does in complicated battles. As afternoon heat pressed down upon the battlefield, both sides suffered heavily. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. Wounded men crawled through trampled ground, searching desperately for water. Officers struggled to restore order among unitors scattered across miles of confusion. The dust never fully settled. Not physically, not politically. In the end, neither empire achieved decisive dominance at Kadesh. Egypt claimed victory publicly. The Hittites retained influence over much of Syria afterward. Modern historians usually describe the battle as strategically favorable to the Hittites despite Egyptian propaganda. But ordinary soldiers would not remember strategy first. They would remember noise, the smell of blood and animal sweat baking beneath the sun. The strange silence after fighting finally slowed. One of the remarkable things about Kadesh is how vividly the battle survived in memory. Ramesses ordered detailed accounts carved onto Egyptian temples, preserving scenes of combat, panic, bravery, and royal heroism. The Hittites preserved their own diplomatic and administrative perspectives through archives and treaties, two great powers shaping memory against one another, both needing history itself to behave politically. And still, beneath official narratives, the human reality lingers quietly. Somewhere after the battle, wounded survivors sat beside small fires at dusk, cleaning blood from bronze blades with shaking hands. Somewhere a messenger rode hard toward Hattusa, carrying uncertain reports through gathering darkness. Somewhere families waited months before learning whether sons or husbands would ever return north again. Victory rarely feels clean up close. The Battle of Kadesh did not end the rivalry between Egypt and the Hittites, but it changed its tone. Neither side could easily destroy the other. Both empires faced mounting pressures elsewhere. Gradually, diplomacy would begin replacing direct confrontation, not because trust suddenly appeared, because exhaustion eventually becomes persuasive. As night falls now over the plain near Kadesh, the battlefield grows colder. Fires burn across scattered camps while distant horses shift restlessly in the dark. The dead remain where they fell until burial parties move carefully through the silence. And above the smoke drifting upward into the Syrian night, the stars shine with terrible calmness over men who spent the entire day trying to prove themselves immortal. Empires are held together by grain more than glory. By the time the sun rises over Hattusa, carts already creak through the streets carrying sacks of barley, jars of oil, bundles of timber, bronze fittings, dried figs, wool cloth, and endless administrative worries disguised as cargo. Drivers shout at stubborn animals, while officials stand nearby counting deliveries with tired concentration. Somewhere a wheel breaks, somewhere a shipment arrives late, somewhere a clerk quietly realizes the numbers no longer match. The Hittite Empire now stretches across vast and difficult territory, but conquest is only the beginning of imperial life. Maintaining power requires roads, storage systems, taxation, labor, communication, diplomacy, and relentless organization. Armies may seize cities dramatically. Keeping them loyal afterward becomes slower and more exhausting work. You'll begin to notice how physical empire really is. Everything depends upon the movement. Food must travel, messages must travel, metal, wood, horses, textiles, tools, and people all move constantly through the kingdom like blood through a body that never fully rests. And roads in the Bronze Age are unforgiving things. Rain transforms them into deep mud. Summer heat cracks the ground beneath wagon wheels. Bridges collapse. River crossings become dangerous after storms. Bandits watch isolated stretches carefully because supply caravans carry concentrated wealth. A delayed shipment might weaken an entire military campaign. The Hittite administration developed sophisticated systems, partly because geography demanded it. Central Anatolia alone presented enormous logistical difficulties, and the empire extended far beyond that harsh plateau into Syria and neighbouring regions. Governors monitored resources. Officials recorded taxes. Storehouses preserved grain against famine and military necessity, at least when harvest succeeded, because beneath all imperial ambition waited the simple uncertainty of agriculture. A dry season could damage entire provinces. An early frost might undo months of labour quietly overnight. Most people living inside the Hittite world remained farmers, herders, labourers, or craftsmen whose lives revolved around practical survival rather than royal politics. Their labour sustained the empire whether they admired it or not. You can picture them now, bent backs in grain fields beneath hard sunlight, hands roughened by rope, stone, and wet earth, children carrying water jars heavier than they should be carrying. History remembers kings because clay tablets preserve their names, but kingdoms survived because ordinary people kept working despite exhaustion. That truth remains stubbornly constant across centuries. Inside Hattusa, officials oversee a growing bureaucratic system managing tribute and redistribution. Goods arrive from subject territories and allied regions, then move outward again toward armies, temples, workshops, and royal households. The palace becomes not merely a political centre, but an enormous administrative engine. The archives expand endlessly. Inventories of livestock, records of land grants, lists of workers assigned to state labour, instructions for transporting grain during shortages. The language often sounds dry to modern readers, yet behind every tablet sits a human situation, hungry soldiers waiting for supplies, farmers negotiating tax obligations after poor harvests, scribes struggling to keep accurate records while political pressures mount around them. Bureaucracy is simply survival written down carefully. The Hittites also depended heavily upon specialized labor. Metal workers shaped bronze weapons and tools essential for military and economic life. Chariot construction required skilled carpenters and leatherworkers. Textile production consumed vast amounts of human effort, much of it performed by women inside households or organized workshops. Ancient economies rested upon invisible repetition. Spinning wool, repairing harnesses, grinding grain, mending sandals. The empire consumed labor continuously, and still shortages appeared. One surviving feature of Hittite administration that feels surprisingly humane is the legal system's occasional concern with practical compromise over harsh abstraction. Laws addressed injury, theft, land disputes, marriage arrangements, labor obligations, and compensation. Punishments sometimes favored fines rather than automatic execution. Not always, certainly. Ancient justice could still be brutal, yet the legal culture often appears more pragmatic than purely cruel. Perhaps difficult landscapes encourage practicality. Eventually, the military machine itself required astonishing resources. Horses demanded careful breeding, training, feeding, and medical attention. Chariot teams consumed enormous amounts of grain and labor. Campaign seasons disrupted agricultural routines because men needed for farming also marched with armies. War reached far beyond battlefields. A campaign in Syria might mean fewer hands available for harvest hundreds of miles away in Anatolia. An exhausted mule dying beside a mountain road could delay supplies enough to affect distant political decisions later. You'll begin to understand how fragile the imperial system really is beneath its outward power. Everything depends upon coordination, and coordination always risks failure. At night in provincial towns, local administrators probably sat beside oil lamps reviewing tribute records while listening to wind push softly against wooden shutters. Somewhere a governor worries that grain quotas cannot be met after flooding damaged fields. Somewhere a merchant calculates whether border instability will destroy profits before his caravan reaches the next city safely. An empire creates anxiety almost as efficiently as wealth. Even the royal family remains trapped inside these practical realities. Kings cannot simply command prosperity into existence. They depend upon harvests, weather, labor systems, loyal officials, and functioning roads just like everyone else, though with higher stakes attached. A famine threatens legitimacy. A failed campaign weakens political authority. Supply problem becomes spiritual problems once people begin questioning divine favor. And all the while, new pressures gather around the edges of the Bronze Age world. Trade networks grow increasingly unstable. Regional rivalries sharpen. Climate fluctuations may already be affecting agricultural reliability in some areas. Powerful states continue competing for influence while depending upon interconnected systems vulnerable to disruption. The world holding the Hittite Empire together is becoming more complicated than ever before, which also means it is becoming easier to break. As darkness settles over. Hattusa again. Warehouse doors close against the cold night air. Guards patrol storehouses filled with grain meant to sustain armies and cities through uncertain seasons ahead. Somewhere nearby, an exhausted scribe rubs cramped fingers before reaching for another clay tablet because the accounting is still unfinished. It is always unfinished. Before dawn, the queen is already awake. The palace remains mostly dark around her. A few lamps burn low beside painted walls while servants move carefully through corridors wrapped against the chill. Outside, wind slides across the stones of Hattusa with a hollow sound that seems older than the kingdom itself. Somewhere in the distance, temple bells answer the morning. The Hittite court has always depended upon women more than many neighboring kingdoms openly admitted, not simply as wives or mothers, though they were certainly both, but as diplomats, ritual authorities, political negotiators, and stabilizing figures inside a world where kings often died violently or unexpectedly. Empires remember powerful men loudly. They remember powerful women more cautiously, and yet their influence lingers everywhere once you begin looking closely enough. The title of Tawananna carried enormous significance in Hittite society. The chief queen participated in major religious ceremonies, managed courtly responsibilities, and retained authority that could survive beyond her husband's death. This continuity created a strange and delicate balance inside royal succession. A new king might inherit the throne while the previous queen still held ceremonial prestige and institutional power. You can imagine the tension, carefully polite conversations across banquet tables, measured silences during ritual procession, servants watching expressions nervously while pretending not to notice anything at all. The palace in Hattusa was never emotionally simple. One of the most influential queens known to history is Pudu-Hepa, wife of Hattusili III during the 13th century BCE. She emerges from surviving records not as a shadowy background figure, but as an active political presence whose intelligence and authority shaped imperial diplomacy directly. Her voice still survives on tablets pressed by scribes thousands of years ago. That alone feels quietly extraordinary. Pudu-Hepa likely came originally from Kidzuwatna in southern Anatolia, a region deeply influenced by Hurrian culture and religious traditions. Her marriage to Hattusili may have begun during a military campaign, though later accounts naturally soften political realities into more orderly stories. Ancient royal marriages often combined affection, ambition, and strategy so thoroughly that separating them becomes impossible. Perhaps genuine tenderness existed between them. Perhaps necessity created closeness over time. Most human relationships are more complicated than neat categories allow. Pudu-Hepa became deeply involved in religious administration and international diplomacy. She corresponded directly with foreign rulers, including the Egyptian court after relations between Egypt and the Hittites gradually improved following years of hostility. Imagine the patience required for such diplomacy, every message travelling weeks across dangerous roads, every phrase considered carefully because misunderstandings could reopen old conflicts, and beneath the formal language lived real emotions, pride, suspicion, weariness, ambition, grief. The famous peace treaty between Egypt and the Hittites emerged during this broader atmosphere of cautious stabilization. After decades of rivalry, both empires recognized the practical limits of endless conflict. Assyria was growing stronger in the east. Internal pressures mounted elsewhere. Stability suddenly appeared more valuable than battlefield prestige. The treaty, it said, remains one of the earliest surviving international peace agreements known in detail. Yet even peace required constant emotional maintenance. Royal marriages reinforced the agreement, gifts crossed borders, correspondence continued. Pudu-Hepa herself communicated with Egyptian royalty in ways that reveal confidence, intelligence, and political sophistication. You can almost picture her dictating letters inside warm lamplight while scribes work nearby, recording carefully phrased words intended for courts hundreds of miles away. Outside the palace, ordinary women carried the empire differently. Most lived far from royal influence, occupied instead with grinding grain, weaving textiles, raising children, managing households, tending animals, and surviving difficult seasons. Their labor remained essential yet largely invisible within official records, unless legal disputes or property matters brought them briefly into written history. Still, traces survive. A woman inheriting land, a marriage contract negotiated carefully, temple personnel assigned ritual duties, the legal system sometimes granted women recognizable economic and social rights unusual for the ancient world, though always within a strongly hierarchical society shaped by class and status. No ancient kingdom was truly gentle, yet daily life required cooperation more than domination alone. Inside provincial towns and villages, women likely managed enormous practical responsibilities while men travelled seasonally for trade, military service, or labor obligations. During campaigns, entire communities depended upon those left behind maintaining agriculture and household survival. Empire rested upon their endurance too. At night across Anatolia, you might hear spinning wheels turning softly beside dying fires while snow gathers against outer walls. Mothers patch worn clothing by weak light. Older women tell stories remembered from generations before Hittite kings ruled the plateau. History continues quietly inside ordinary rooms, and sometimes those rooms shape empires more than battlefields do. The royal household itself remained emotionally dangerous despite outward ceremony. Succession disputes still threatened stability. Brothers mistrusted one another. Sons competed for influence. Queens navigated shifting loyalties where one political mistake might isolate entire factions. Puduhepa and Hattusa ruled during a period requiring careful balance. The empire still possessed enormous strength, but strain showed increasingly beneath the surface. Assyria pressed harder from the east. Economic pressures deepened. Vassal loyalty remained uncertain in some regions. Powerful courts grow tired eventually. You begin to sense fatigue entering the imperial atmosphere now. Not collapse yet, but weariness, the kind that settles slowly into institutions after generations of military pressure and political vigilance. As evening returns to Hattusa, lamps glow again behind palace windows while cold wind moves across the high Anatolian hills. Somewhere in the royal quarters, Puduhepa studies another diplomatic message beside flickering firelight, knowing every carefully chosen word may help preserve peace for a little longer. And somewhere beyond the walls, ordinary families close their doors against the dark, hoping tomorrow arrives quietly. Winter settles heavily over Hattusa. Snow gathers along the outer walls in uneven ridges shaped by wind. The roads beyond the capital grow quieter each day as carts disappear beneath grey skies and frozen ground hardens like stone. Inside houses across the city, people pull cloaks tighter around themselves while smoke from hearth fires clings stubbornly to ceilings darkened by years of soot. The empire feels tired now. Not defeated, not broken, but tired in the deep, structural way large systems become tired after generations of pressure. By the late 13th century BCE, the Hittite Empire still commands enormous territory stretching across Anatolia and into Syria. Treaties remain active, armies still march when necessary. Royal ceremonies continue, foreign envoys still arrive through the gates of Hattusa carrying gifts and carefully rehearsed politeness. Yet strain shows everywhere once you know how to look. Administrative burdens increase. Regional instability spreads gradually. Climate fluctuation may be affecting harvest reliability across parts of the eastern Mediterranean world. Trade routes become less predictable, rival powers sharpen their ambitions. And always there is Assyria. The Assyrian kingdom, once overshadowed by larger rivals, has grown steadily more aggressive and organized. Under rulers such as Tukulti-Ninurta-Tumuai, Assyria expands westward and northward with alarming energy. Hittite influence in Syria now faces a determined competitor capable of sustained military pressure. The balance between great powers begins shifting uneasily. You can imagine the mood inside the Hittite court during these years. Not panic exactly, and experienced governments rarely panic immediately, but concern accumulates quietly through reports, delayed shipments, nervous governors, and difficult military calculations. A city requests additional true. A harvest comes in smaller than expected. A vassal ruler hesitates before reaffirming loyalty. None of these events alone destroys an empire. Together they create exhaustion. Inside the archives at Hattusa, scribes continue recording treaties and administrative orders, though the tone of surviving correspondence sometimes feels increasingly strained. Appeals for grain appear. Concerns about frontier security multiply. The machinery of imperial governance grows heavier precisely when resources become harder to maintain smoothly. Ancient empires often collapse gradually long before they collapse visibly. The emotional unraveling begins first. Trust weakens, confidence erodes. People start preparing privately for instability, even while public ceremonies continue projecting order. Ordinary life becomes more difficult during such periods, though unevenly. In some regions, communities may have experienced relative stability for years at a time. Elsewhere, raids, crop failures, political unrest, or supply shortages created chronic anxiety. You can picture a farming family somewhere in central Anatolia, listening carefully to distant rumours carried by merchants stopping overnight before continuing south. News travels slowly but never stops entirely. Assyrian victories, rebellions, grain shortages, attacks along trade routes. People living far from palaces still sense when larger systems begin weakening. The Hittite economy depends heavily upon interconnected regional networks. Vulnerable to disruption, bronze production requires imported tin. Military systems depend upon grain movement and horse maintenance. Diplomatic relationships rely upon stable communication and predictable authority. Remove enough pieces and the structure begins trembling, and yet daily routines continue because they must. Women grind grain beside cold windows while children sleep nearby, wrapped beneath rough blankets. Stable workers feed horses before dawn despite freezing wind. Temple rituals proceed according to sacred calendars because abandoning them entirely would feel terrifying. Human beings cling to rhythm during uncertain times. Ritual becomes reassurance. Routine becomes resistance against fear. One of the more haunting aspects of late Hittite history is how incomplete the surviving evidence becomes. The archives continue for a while, then thin out, records fragment, administrative continuity weakens. Historians reconstruct these final generations cautiously because the evidence itself feels damaged and tired. The silence approaching the empire arrives slowly, not all at once. Within the royal family, succession tensions continue complicating politics. Hittite kingship never entirely escaped internal instability, and later rulers governed under mounting external pressure simultaneously. Maintaining legitimacy required military competence, religious authority, diplomatic skill, and practical administration, all functioning together. That becomes increasingly difficult in hard times. A weak harvest might reduce tax income. Reduced income weakens military readiness. Military weakness encourages rebellion. Rebellion disrupts trade further. Ancient systems could spiral downward with frightening speed once confidence faltered. Meanwhile, populations beyond the empire's borders are moving in new patterns. Historians still debate intensely today. Some regions experience migrations, others face political collapse or ecological stress. Trade networks across the eastern Mediterranean grow unstable in ways that ripple outward unpredictably. The Bronze Age world itself is beginning to shake. At night in Hattusa now, the city feels colder than before, not physically colder perhaps, though winters on the Anatolian plateau remain harsh enough. The difference is emotional. Less certainty, more listening. Guards along the walls pause longer when distant sounds echo through darkness. Officials reread correspondence searching for hidden implications. Merchants calculate risks more carefully before committing caravans to dangerous roads. Even the palace seems wearier. Lamps burn later into the night while administrators struggle through mounting problems without clear solutions. Somewhere a royal advisor studies maps spread across a wooden table, tracing vulnerable frontiers with tired fingers. Somewhere else, a queen offers prayers before sacred statues whose calm expressions reveal nothing. Empires rarely understand they are dying while the process unfolds. From inside, decline feels temporary, manageable. Another difficult season to survive. And perhaps that belief is necessary. No society could function while fully accepting collapse as inevitable. Still, beyond the snowy hills surrounding Hattusa, the larger world continues shifting in dangerous ways now impossible to fully control. Something immense is approaching through the dark. At first, they arrive only as rumours. Ships seen along distant coasts, burned settlements farther south, refugees appearing unexpectedly at market towns carrying little besides frightened children and contradictory stories. Some speak unfamiliar languages. Others speak languages traders recognize. though their voices carry the strained exhaustion of people who have travelled too far without rest. Inside Hattusa, officials listen carefully. The Empire has spent generations managing threats it understands. Rival kingdoms, rebellious governors, border warfare, failed harvests, but now the wider Bronze Age world itself is becoming unstable in ways nobody fully comprehends, and instability spreads faster than certainty ever does. Modern historians often group many of these movements and attacks beneath the broad term Sea Peoples, though the reality was likely far more complicated than a single invading force. Different populations moved across the eastern Mediterranean during this period for different reasons. Some migrated gradually, some raided opportunistically, some may have been displaced by famine, political collapse, or earlier conflicts elsewhere. Ancient people watching these events unfold would not have seen a clean historical category. They would have seen confusion, smoke rising above coastal towns, trade ships failing to arrive, entire regions becoming unpredictable almost overnight. The interconnected world sustaining the great Bronze Age kingdoms begins unraveling strand by strand. For the Hittites, this comes at the worst possible moment. Internal strain already weakens imperial resilience. Assyria continues pressing from the east. Agricultural pressures complicate food supply. Political cohesion feels increasingly fragile. Now long-distance trade routes become dangerous too. I'll begin to understand how dependent ancient empires were upon systems extending far beyond their borders. Tin for bronze, production travelled enormous distances. Luxury goods reinforced diplomacy. Grain shortages in one region required imports from another. Merchants carried not only cargo but information, cultural exchange and economic stability. When movement falters, fear grows quickly. Some surviving texts from across the eastern Mediterranean describe desperation during these years, appeals for aid, warnings about enemy movements, pleas for grain shipments, cities once prosperous suddenly sounding frightened and isolated. The emotional atmosphere of the age changes noticeably. Less confidence. More urgency. At coastal settlements, families may have slept uneasily listening for unfamiliar ships during the night. Inland communities worried about caravan routes no longer considered safe. Local rulers faced impossible choices about military priorities while resources shrank around them. And still winter arrived each year, demanding ordinary survival regardless of imperial crisis. Somewhere in Anatolia, a farmer still repairs fences after storms. Somewhere a mother still bakes coarse bread before dawn while snow melts slowly from the roof outside. Human routine continues stubbornly even as political worlds fracture. But the fractures are widening now. The Hittite Empire depended upon maintaining authority across large territories connected through loyalty, military force, administrative coordination, and economic exchange. Once enough regions became unstable simultaneously, central control weakened rapidly. Communication slows, supply systems fail. Provincial loyalty becomes conditional. One city closes its gates, another stops sending tribute. The empire begins losing coherence. You can almost feel the anxiety spreading through Hattusa during these final decades. Messengers arrive with conflicting reports. Frontier commanders request reinforcements. The capital struggles to provide. Grain stores become more politically important than ceremonial displays. Even temple rituals may have carried a sharper edge of desperation now. What prayers do people offer when the familiar world itself begins dissolving? The Hittites were not alone in facing catastrophe. Across the eastern Mediterranean, several major Bronze Age civilizations suffered collapse or severe weakening around this period. Mycenaean palace systems in Greece fragmented. Cities across the Levant experienced destruction. Egyptian records describe desperate battles against invading groups approaching by land and sea. It feels less like a single disaster than a chain reaction. A world too interconnected to fail gracefully. Historians still debate the exact causes behind this broader Bronze Age collapse. Climate stress likely contributed. Earthquakes may have damaged already vulnerable systems. Warfare disrupted trade networks. Migration pressures intensified instability. Internal political weaknesses amplified every external shock. No single explanation fully satisfies. Reality is usually messier than that, and from inside the collapse, nobody possessed the distant perspective later. Historians would attempt constructing. People simply experienced fear, hunger, uncertainty, displacement, and exhaustion one season at a time. At night in Hattusa now, the city no longer feels confidently imperial. The great walls still stand, temples still burn with sacred fire. Royal authority still exists formally, yet unease lingers everywhere like smoke trapped beneath a ceiling. A merchant delays travel south. A soldier worries privately about unpaid provisions. An official rereads troubling reports beside dim lamplight while cold wind rattles wooden shutters. The future feels narrower than before. One haunting truth about collapsing civilizations is how ordinary many final days appear while they are happening. Children still laugh occasionally in courtyards. Dogs still bark at strangers. Bread still bakes. Arguments still erupt over property boundaries and missing livestock. People continue living because there is nothing else to do, and perhaps somewhere beyond the walls tonight. Travelers move cautiously through darkness, carrying news too large for any single kingdom to contain. News of burning ports, broken alliances, empty roads. News that the old Bronze Age world is beginning to disappear. One day, the roads to Hattusa simply grow quieter. Not empty immediately. Collapse rarely arrives with perfect dramatic timing. A few caravans still appear through the northern approaches. Messengers still ride between settlements carrying outdated instructions and fading authority. Temple fires continue burning. Guards still patrol sections of the walls at night, cloaks pulled tight against the Anatolian wind. But something essential has begun withdrawing from the city. Confidence, perhaps, or continuity. By the early 12th century BCE, the Hittite Empire is breaking apart. The great political structure built across centuries through war, diplomacy, religion, and relentless administration no longer holds together. Provincial territories drift beyond central control. Trade systems fail repeatedly. Rival powers reshape surviving regions according to new realities, and Hattusa itself begins emptying slowly into silence. You can imagine the atmosphere during those final years. Storehouses less full than before, workshops closing early because supplies no longer arrive reliably, officials continuing paperwork nobody entirely believes still matters. Empires rarely stop performing authority immediately after losing it. Habit survives longer than certainty. Inside the palace, surviving administrators probably still issue orders, still organize rituals, still attempt to preserve normal rhythms, but the network sustaining those rhythms has weakened too badly. Messages travel slowly or not at all. Garrisons become isolated. Allied rulers reconsider loyalties that once seemed permanent. The great machine of empire loses coordination piece by piece. Some evidence suggests Hattusa may not have fallen in one final catastrophic siege as older histories once imagined. The reality appears more complicated and strangely quieter. Parts of the city show signs of burning and destruction, yes, but also abandonment. People leaving deliberately, institutions dissolving gradually. The capital may have been evacuated or partially emptied before final devastation reached it fully. That possibility changes the emotional picture entirely. Instead of one dramatic last stand, imagine a long retreat from certainty. Families packing tools and clothing onto carts. Temple workers removing sacred objects from vulnerable sanctuaries. Animals driven southward through cold morning mist while smoke rises from abandoned hearths behind them. You begin to notice how intimate collapse really is. Not abstract, not cinematic, just human beings deciding what they can carry, The massive walls of Hattusa still dominate the hills during these final days. Lion gates and stone fortifications remain physically impressive even as political authority evaporates around them. Wind moves through empty courtyards. Unused buildings gather dust. Wells echo differently once fewer voices surround them. A city can feel loneliness settling into it, especially after centuries of noise. Somewhere in the archives, clay tablets remain stacked carefully inside rooms nobody will enter again for thousands of years. Treaties with Egypt, legal records, ritual instructions, inventories of grain and livestock, the accumulated memory of an empire waiting silently beneath collapsing roofs. There is something deeply moving about that. So much human effort pressed into clay, so many anxieties, so many ambitions, and then silence covering everything. The population surviving after imperial collapse do not disappear entirely, of course. People continue living across Anatolia and northern Syria. Smaller political states emerge from the ruins of larger systems. Some Neo-Hittite kingdoms preserve elements of Hittite culture and language for generations afterward, especially in southern regions. History rarely ends cleanly. It fragments. Traditions survive unevenly inside new worlds. Still, the centralized imperial power based at Hattusa is gone. The old Bronze Age order has shattered across much of the eastern Mediterranean. Palace economies collapse. International diplomacy shrinks. Long-distance trade contracts severely. Writing systems disappear from some regions for centuries. The world grows smaller again. Poorer too. You can picture the abandoned capital years later. Grass pushing slowly between cracked stones. Roof beams collapsed inward after harsh winters. Wild animals moving cautiously through once ceremonial spaces. Rainwater gathering inside broken courtyards where priests once conducted sacred rituals before crowds of officials and musicians. Without people, cities lose memory quickly. Only the landscape remains patient. Travelers passing nearby generations later may have seen the ruins and wondered vaguely who built such enormous walls. Stories survive for a while, then distort, then fade almost entirely. The names of kings once feared across the Near East gradually disappear from common memory. Sappiluliuma Muatali Hattusili, names carried once through royal courts and battlefields until they dissolve into silence beneath Anatolian soil, and yet traces persist stubbornly. A carved stone reused in a village wall, fragments of old road systems crossing the hills, ritual traditions absorbed into later cultures without anyone remembering their original source. Human history leaves sediments behind even after collapse. As night falls over the emptying city, cold air moves through abandoned halls where lamps no longer burn. Somewhere beyond the walls, former citizens continue southward along muddy roads beneath darkening skies, carrying children, animals, tools, memories, and grief into an uncertain future. Behind them, Hattusa settles slowly into darkness, not erased, just waiting. For centuries, the hills around Hattusa sleep quietly beneath grass and weather. Seasons pass across the old capital without witnesses who understand what once stood there. Snow gathers along broken stone walls each winter. Spring rains soften the earth above buried archives. Chasseurs move animals through ruined gateways where kings once received foreign envoys beneath banners and ceremonial music. The empire becomes landscape, and landscape forgets slowly. Long after the Hittite world disappears politically, fragments of memory survive in strange and uncertain ways. Some traditions linger inside the Neo-Hittite states scattered across parts of Syria and Anatolia. Ancient names echo faintly through later cultures. Assyrian records preserve references to powerful rulers from earlier centuries, But the full shape of the Hittite civilization fades almost completely from human awareness. For thousands of years, nobody truly remembers them. That silence feels extraordinary now. An empire once powerful enough to challenge Egypt vanishes so thoroughly that later civilizations walk across its ruins without understanding what lies beneath their feet. The clay tablets remain buried. The treaties sleep inside collapsed rooms. The names of queens and kings rest hidden beneath layers of dust and stone. History is far more fragile than it appears. I begin to feel the strange loneliness of forgotten civilizations, not destroyed dramatically in memory, but simply absent, unspoken, their fears, ambitions, victories, and griefs no longer connected to living minds. And yet the earth keeps records patiently. In the 19th century, travellers and archaeologists moving through the Ottoman Empire began noticing unusual ruins and inscriptions in central Anatolia. At first, understanding came slowly and imperfectly. The scattered evidence seemed mysterious, disconnected. Then more discoveries followed. Fragments of writing, stone reliefs, ancient seals, broken tablets carrying wedge-shaped marks nobody immediately understood. The buried world of the Hittites started rising gradually back into human awareness. Excavations at Bogazkoy, the site of ancient Hattusa, transformed historical understanding during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Archaeologists uncovered massive fortifications, temples, royal buildings, and eventually enormous archives filled with clay tablets preserved accidentally through fire and collapse. Imagine that moment, a hand brushing dirt carefully from a tablet untouched for over 3,000 years, a forgotten king's words emerging again into daylight. There is something deeply intimate about archaeology at its best. Not treasure hunting exactly, more like listening carefully across impossible distances. The archives changed everything. Scholars slowly deciphered the Hittite language and realized they were encountering one of the major powers of the ancient Near East. Hidden in partial civilizations for millennia, diplomatic treaties appeared, legal codes, religious rituals, letters between rulers, administrative records, an entire emotional world returning piece by piece. Some of the discoveries startled historians profoundly. The famous treaty between Hattusa and Ramesses emerged as one of the oldest surviving peace agreements known in detail. Royal prayers revealed vulnerability rather than constant triumph. Legal texts suggested a practical society navigating complex realities rather than semper brutalicet. The Hittites became human again, not myths, not ruins. People who worried about harvests and succession disputes. People who negotiated marriages and treaties by lamplight. People who rode through cold Anatolian winters carrying messages between uncertain kingdoms. People who buried their dead and prayed desperately during plague years. As excavations continued, the physical scale of Hattusa itself became clearer. The city had been immense, sprawling across rocky hills, surrounded by monumental walls and ceremonial gates. Lion sculptures guarded entrances. Temples clustered around sacred spaces. Administrative buildings stored the written memory of an empire, and all of it had waited silently underground while entire later civilizations rose and fell above it. There is a humbling feeling in that realization. Modern life often feels permanent while we are inside it. Roads, governments, languages, institutions. Yet the Hittites once believed their world permanent too, at least on ordinary mornings before catastrophe fully arrived. Human beings build carefully against impermanence. Still the centuries pass. Today, visitors walking through the ruins of Hattusa encounter a place both grand and strangely peaceful. Wind moves through old gateways. Grass covers ancient foundations. The Anatolian sky stretches wide above stones shaped by the hands long returned to dust. You can stand there quietly and feel time behaving differently, not vanished exactly. Layered, the empire survives now through fragments. Tablets in museums, archaeological reconstructions, scholarly debates, weathered reliefs showing kings, gods, warriors, and processions carved into stone. No living voice speaks the Hittite language naturally anymore. Yet something human remains recognizable across the distance. Ambition, fear, love of stability, weariness during long winters, relief when spring returns, the desire to leave some proof that a life existed at all. And perhaps that is why forgotten civilizations continue pulling at us so strongly late at night, when the modern world grows quieter and history begins feeling less like information and more like memory belonging to all of us somehow. The Hittites disappeared. Then they returned, not physically, not politically, but gently through patient rediscovery into the long human conversation again. And tonight, after all these centuries, you have walked beside them a while beneath the cold Anatolian stars. Thank you for spending this quiet stretch of history with me tonight. These old civilizations can seem distant at first, buried beneath unfamiliar names and ruined stone, but after a while their humanity begins to feel unexpectedly close. The tired officials working by lamplight, the anxious rulers waiting for news from distant roads, families trying to survive another winter while empires shifted around them. History softens when you stay with it long enough. If this journey through the Hittite world stayed with you, I would genuinely love to hear what moments lingered most in your mind. Maybe it was the silence of abandoned Hattusa, maybe the diplomacy between rival kings, maybe simply the image of ordinary people carrying on beneath enormous uncertain skies. And if there is another forgotten corner of history you would like to wander through on some future night, you are always welcome to return here again. For now, though, the fires in the old Anatolian hills are burning low, the roads are quiet, the palace lamps have dimmed. Somewhere beyond the ruins, cold wind still moves through the grass exactly as it did 3,000 years ago. I hope the night ahead feels calm and gentle wherever you are listening from.